I would try to describe PassBlue to you in preparation for this presentation, except that I assume that Dulcie Leimbach is going to do that much more professionally and clearly than I can. What I will tell you about is that I met Dulcie Leimbach for the first Leimbach for the Buck and her husband John for the first time a little over an hour ago. And if the presentation is 1/10 as interesting and nice as you are, it's going to be a nice time. So with that, PassBlue, Dulcie Leimbach.
Okay. Thanks very much for having me. I was asked because someone suggested that because we were a women-led media site, and it's true, we are women-led, and sometimes that works against us and sometimes it works for us. You know, most media sites are pretty macho, and we're not quite so macho, but sometimes we try to be macho just to get some attention, because it's very hard to get attention as a small media site when you're competing with the big guys. My background is 22 years at the New York Times as an editor and a writer. So I got my boot camp experience there. I learned on the job. They won't want me to say that, but I did learn on the job. And because I was a writer first, I could switch to editing because I knew how to fix the writer's copy. And I always pretty much made the writers sound better than their original intent. And that's how I survived the New York Times. But then I switched and left in the paper, having learned quite a lot and having edited some of the big stars, including the columnists like Maureen Dowd and Nicholas Kristof, and very, very demanding people working on tight deadlines. And so I got really fast. And I got so fast that I couldn't stop my heart from racing. So I decided to work for a nonprofit instead that covered the UN, and it was called UNA USA. And I was always curious about the UN because basically I like to travel, and because I don't have much money to travel, this was a way to sort of channel that interest. And so when I was at UNA USA, which is a nonprofit site that promotes the work of the UN in a favorable light. And so as a journalist, I found this sort of stifling because I would edit their magazine, and then I put their magazine online. And I couldn't write or publish anything that was even slightly negative about the UN. And of course, the UN has a lot of problems. Some brought on by itself and some brought on by outside players. And so I was a little frustrated. And I worked closely at UNA USA with another ex-New York Times person, Barbara Cossette, who was the India bureau chief and the UN bureau chief, and she was a foreign correspondent all across the world. And she happened to be working at UNA USA after she left the Times as well. So we sort of teamed up together as two journalists trying to fight back the management by saying, it's okay if we publish an article that's slightly critical. We need to be constructive. And so we managed to make some headway there. But they were pretty uncomfortable with journalists in the nonprofit world. They're a little afraid of us. And so the organization basically shrank considerably. This was during the recession. And I was laid off. And so I thought, okay, I'll start my own publication, because now I sort of understand the UN. I know how to do a publication. I know how to do journalism. So Barbara and we switched gears and we did our own independent coverage of the UN, and now we can say whatever we want. And that's a really freeing state of mind. We didn't have much money, and so it turned out that we didn't really need that much money to keep a website going, because a lot of people wanted to contribute articles to us without getting paid. Nevertheless, we still needed money, so we started to get grants, and our first grant, major grant, came from the Carnegie Corporation of New York. And so they're still with us. They're still supporting us after many, many years. And they're not normally donors to journalism, but because the journalism industry has basically convulsed, a lot of foundations are stepping in to support journalism. Yet nevertheless, they still want us to find other revenue, so we get some ads. But anyway, let's get to the content. So PassBlue is basically named after the passport that's just given to UN career staff people, allowing them entree to around the world without having to get visas. And my husband John came up with that idea, and he's my IT person. He's a volunteer person who has a full-time job, and he designed the site. And so he's stuck with us too from the beginning in 2011. So basically, you know, the UN is an amorphous institution, and it's really it's made up. I know this is a cliche, but it's made up of the member states, the 193 countries that belong to the UN, which is all countries in the world. So some people love to blame the UN just, you know, in a blanket way when they fail, and they do fail because they're working in very controversial areas and problems. So it's easy to blame the UN. Oh, the UN, you know, they failed in Rwanda. They failed to stop the genocide. Well, what you don't know, or what most people don't know, is that there were decisions behind the scenes not allowing peacekeepers to go into Rwanda, and some of those decisions were backed by the United States. So what we try to do is be fair in our coverage, and we do name names. We do say the United States and other powerful members of the UN are calling the shots, and the shots are not always what you'd like to think they would be in terms of doing something positive for the world. So we have moved from a broad range of topics, because the UN has its fingers in so many pies across the world, to focusing on peacekeeping, which is basically the most visible aspect of the UN, the blue helmets. And the peacekeepers are authorized by the Security Council, which is the most powerful body in the UN. And that powerful body is run by basically 5 countries, which are the permanent 5 members. And it's Britain, China, France, UK, US, and Russia. So if you think that basically the UN is run by member states, well, it's basically run by 5 member states. And of those 5 member states, the US is the most powerful because it makes the largest donations to the UN budget, both the regular budget and the peacekeeping budget. And that calculation is based on its GDP, strictly how rich the country is. It doesn't hurt that it is also based in the US. So we cover peacekeeping, and that's a huge part of the UN. Very problematic part of the UN, because peacekeepers are sent into countries where there are conflicts, and they're not always welcome, but their job is basically to keep the peace, you know, and that can mean any number of things. And then we started covering women's rights, because the UN has a UN Women Agency tasked with ensuring that women get equal rights, tasked with ensuring gender equality. It doesn't do a great job at it, because again, the UN is made up of many member states who don't really want women to have equality. And you can just imagine how many countries around the world who they're not too comfortable with that. And you'd be surprised at some of who those countries are. So we covered women's issues, peacekeeping, we cover human rights. The UN has a lot of bodies protecting human rights. Again, it has a hard time carrying some of those policies out, because there are some countries like Russia, Turkey, who they're not really comfortable with ensuring that people have their human rights. We made ourselves pretty unpopular early on when we started writing about the UN has a lot of new appointments they make, high-level appointments to senior jobs in the UN Secretariat, which is the core of the UN. And we noticed that most of the senior level appointments were going to men. And one day I was doing the math and I saw that of the last 12 senior appointments, only 2 had been to women. And so I started writing about this, and no one had written about this in the mainstream media that are based in the UN, because they basically are focused on geopolitics. They're not focused on UN internal staffing. So I started writing about the UN high-level appointments and how there were few women, and few women from the developing world. It was, most of these senior level appointments were going to powerful, rich countries. So I made myself very unpopular with the UN high-level senior management people, because I was, basically saying you guys aren't doing your gender equality work. But I did make myself popular at that point with all the women who worked in the UN, because they had been enduring this imbalance from the get-go. And interestingly, the new Secretary General who came on board last January 2017, one of his promises was to appoint an equal number of women to the high-level positions. And he's done it. In his year and a half terms, into a 5-year term, he's already he has more women in his team than any previous Secretary General. And so I like to think that all our articles pointing at this problem helped this cause for women. And one of the other things, it's very hard for us to limit our coverage because there's so many things going on. And we try to remain flexible. And one of the other things we started covering since last summer was Nikki Haley. And as you know, Nikki Haley is the U.S. ambassador to the UN. And we noticed that nobody in the mainstream media was covering her in a concerted way in what she was doing at the UN. They would, CNN would pick up something that she said, and the large media, they weren't being very critical of her. They were just repeating what she said without a lot of context. And so we met editorially, and one of our regular contributors said, and he was the Reuters UN correspondent for many years. He had retired, but he still was writing for us. We said, you're missing a big opportunity. You need to cover Nikki Haley. And we said, yeah, okay, let's do it. And then we started doing it immediately. And we sort of developed a reputation at the UN for our bold coverage of Nikki Haley, because nobody was criticizing her at all, because she's a very powerful person. And so we took it on. We took on this topic. And Erwin Arieff, he has been one of the main contributors to this Nikki Haley Watch column. And we were doing it regularly, maybe 1 or 2 articles a month about what Nikki Haley was saying. For example, this story is about how she still uses very blunt, undiplomatic language in the Security Council to get her point across. And at the same time, this article pointed out that the Pentagon press officer was using very diplomatic language, and what a contrast that was between what the Pentagon people were saying and what the UN correspondent, UN ambassador was saying. And this was about based on the American-led strikes on the Syrian territory after the chemical weapons attack. And here's a video of Nikki Haley. This is a UN video, meeting right before she went into the Security Council. And she literally said to the media, I'm really happy to be on Trump's team. He really thought about this military strike. He didn't act rashly. He took several days, and I'm really proud to be on his team. And I was sort of struck by the way she talked about Trump as if he were a child, because she said literally, you know, I'm really proud of him. He didn't act rashly, you know. And well, we know he acted rashly, but anyway, so the article points out the contrast between Nikki Haley's mode of diplomacy and the Pentagon's. So that was one example where we were willing to stick our necks out and compare and contrast Nikki Haley's diplomacy with how the Pentagon was dealing with the chemical weapons strikes. So then we have, now John Bolton is on the scene, so now we're looking at how John Bolton, how Mike Pompeo and Nikki Haley are, you know, basically going to work together under Trump still. And it's going to be a very curious dynamic to see who makes, you know, what remarks.
It's going to be a bumpy ride.
Well, it already is a bumpy ride. But interestingly, this article points out that both Nikki Haley and Mike Pompeo and Bolton may have political aspirations. And so does their boss, Trump. So how it will all play out in terms of who really wants to be president in 2020 and who's going to, you know, who's going to try to jockey for that nomination is going to be interesting to watch. So Nikki Haley has been keeping us very, very busy. She has a Twitter account that we follow closely, and on her Twitter account, she does. She puts pictures of her dog, saying, you know, I went for a walk with my dog in the park. This is the U.S. ambassador to the UN. And then she puts pictures of, you know, some cookies she cooked on her day off and burnt them. And there's a pictures of the burnt cookies. I mean, you know, if this were not real, you could laugh. But she likes to be photographed a lot. And I know this because I'm constantly, when I have to post an article about her, I have to find pictures of her that are available through Creative Commons because I don't have a budget to pay a lot for. So I have gone through hundreds and hundreds of photos. And she likes to be, mostly she likes to be in the center of the picture. And there she's not quite in the center. But she is an ex-governor of South Carolina. So she is a politician. She knows how to get into the camera. And there she is. I was curious who these girls are. And then I asked her press office, and they said, well, they're Israeli schoolgirls on her trip to the Middle East. And I thought, okay, that's a curious thing. And then I was talking to a student at Columbia University, and I said, well, why do you think she would put, you know, non-American schoolgirls? He said, well, she's trying to be, you know, a foreign diplomat. You know, she's trying to project her credence, you know, her global ambassador role. So I thought, okay, that's curious, you know, that I mean, I try to figure out her mindset. So
girls.
What?
They're also
girls. So that sends another message that she's promoting girls and women's rights. Her record is completely the opposite. And we have documented her record as governor of South Carolina, where she even said, you know, women don't care about contraceptives. So, you know, we know that she has said some things to look like she's in favor of women's rights. Then we know she has said other things. And she also works for a man who has gone on record for saying, you know, fairly vulgar things about women. So, I mean, that for me, that's the bottom line. Who does she work for? She works for a pig. Okay. So, you know, for example, so this is her official Twitter page. She's got 1.6 million followers. However, those were carryovers from when she was governor of South Carolina. So it's a slightly misleading number. And in fact, one watchdog group pointed out that she wasn't allowed to use her former Twitter page as governor of South Carolina and then move it over to as the UN ambassador, but she's gone ahead and done it anyway. But here she is socializing, and this is typical on, you know, for a Saturday night. She puts who she went out with and what they did, and that's her husband, who's he was in the military in Afghanistan. And so she had some event, and then on Fridays, generally she puts what her music she's listening to. It's a Rod Stewart kind of morning, happy Friday. And meanwhile the world is completely falling apart, but as long as you've got the right music, that's what counts. Here she put a picture of herself being interviewed by CNN when she was in the Middle East, and she's talking. This was for World Press Freedom Day the other day. And the irony is that she rarely talks to the media at the UN. She just completely dismisses us because we're, not powerful enough. We don't have, the optics.
Maybe she means freedom from the press.
Freedom from the press, and she, she says she supports the truth. So, journalists bring truth to the world, but who knows what the world means, what the word truth means anymore. Here she's coming back to New York City, so, we're all pretty excited about that. So this is our U.S. ambassador to the UN, and I was amused by this picture with Mike Pompeo. This was taken a few days after Nikki Haley announced that she did not get confused when there was a lack of communication. She went on CNN and said, we will impose more sanctions on Russia, and then the next day the White House took that back. And then she said, but I don't get confused. The irony here with her picture of Mike Pompeo as the new Secretary of State is that a few weeks ago, in very heated debates in the Security Council, Russia and the U.S. tend to clash a lot. And sometimes it's amusing to listen to and watch because they get very personal in their speeches. And the Russian ambassador, he talks to the media more than Nikki Haley does. He's more comfortable with it, perhaps. And he's also doesn't have political aspirations. But at one point in his speech, he said to Nikki Haley, you don't have any friends. Nobody likes the U.S. The only friends you can manage to get are those who will vote with you in the Security Council. And there aren't very many of those countries anymore. But so I enjoyed this one because she says that Mike Pompeo is her dear friend. So we have fun with stories like fake news in the UN, why Syria could eventually get a UN peacekeeping force. This story is a first-person story about a woman who works as a prison rights advisor in the UK. The UK has terrible, terrible record on prisoners' conditions. Europe's contraception rate accessibility is very low. And then here we're writing about the potential peace deal. So we have original journalism. We work really hard, and we try to make clear what the UN does, even if sometimes it's unclear to us, because it's still, after all these years, it's still a mysterious organization, and it's very secretive. Okay, any questions? Thank you very much. Yeah, you had your hand up for a while.
Christian Zionist influence on Nikki Haley or just AI pack?
Christian Zionist?
Yeah.
What's that?
They're basically Christian religious people who are trying to use Israel to fulfill biblical prophecy.
Oh yeah, there's a tremendous well of support from the U.S. Evangelical Christians for Nikki Haley and supporting Israel. Yeah, that's a big bastion of support for her.
Yeah, that was because she's fully with the Israelis.
Exactly.
So,
Yeah. No, she's buddies with the Israelis, and we were going to run an article about whether she was too far in with the Israelis and whether she'll suffer for that. But we haven't produced that yet. But yeah, she's close with the Israelis. Yeah.
I think it's easy to criticize her for having a Twitter page that has music and baking cookies, but if a woman wants to be successful in politics, she can't just be ambitious and competent. That doesn't work. She has to be likable.
Exactly.
So
Yep.
either she or her political consultants know that that's a
Oh,
fact
yeah.
of political life.
Yeah, yeah.
So she may not, in fact, want to put out her favorite music or her walking her dog or her social
Yeah.
scene, but clearly she has ambitions to be more than
Yeah.
UN ambassador.
Yeah, no, that's a great point.
So you had talked a lot about the role of civil or states in the UN. But civil society also has a role, and I wonder if you could say something about civil society, which is us,
Yeah.
and the role of NGOs in the UN,
Yeah,
and
no-
how they interact or don't interact with state players.
Yeah, civil societies are like the third member, and they're very, very, they specialize in certain topics like disarmament or human rights. And the wonderful thing about civil society is they are experts. They'll know more than the experts will know because they're so immersed in their world. I think the main struggle for civil society is to get access to powerful people and powerful people in the UN and powerful people in the member states, and to get your voices heard. And also the other problem is a lot of countries like China and Russia do not want to hear from civil society because you're basically saying there's a problem here and it needs to be fixed. And usually the problem revolves around human rights, protection of human rights.
Yeah. How do states suppress the voice of civil society and NGOs?
They won't let them into meetings. They won't let them speak to meetings. They'll dismiss them outright. They have a lot of methods of dismissing civil society, just the way they have methods to dismiss journalists, just discrediting, denying access. There are lots of ways. They've been doing it for years, decades, you know. Yeah.
How useful has the UN really been? The peacekeepers don't do too much peacekeeping. During the problems in the Balkans some years ago, they just stood by while the slaughter went on in Bosnia and Herzegovina and other places. All the UN resolutions to try to constrain Israel from slaughtering the Palestinians are just ignored. Really, you know,
It's very political. Yeah.
The Security Council has a little bit of power, but really, what useful role has the UN served in the world?
In peacekeeping alone, they really can go into a country and stop the warring parties from killing each other.
Where have they done that?
Where have they done that? They've done that in Cyprus. They've been in Cyprus for 50 years. If they pulled out of Cyprus, I think Turkey would move right in and start slaughtering people on the other side. And it just depends on the location and what the dynamics are, what the geopolitics are. Some peacekeeping missions are much more successful than others, but it's all politically driven. So you have to look at who's holding back funding to this peacekeeping mission in X country. Well, maybe it's Russia, maybe it's the US. There's all this shenanigans going on. And so it's easy to say, well, the UN hasn't done anything. But in fact, its hands are tied more often than not by very powerful countries with budgets, with agendas, with national agendas. So that's what we try to do. We try to clarify what's really going on.
The staff at the United Nations, for the most part, are the children of aristocrats in their home countries.
No, I am
meritocracy.
close friends with a lot of people in the Secretariat. They're well schooled, they're well educated, they do come from sometimes from well-off families, but these are very dedicated people and they really are trying to do the right thing. I'm constantly impressed about how passionately they care about the work that they do, like rule of law, like legal rights for people in the Congo. These people are really working hard, but there are a lot of barriers to what they can achieve. Nevertheless, they don't give up. So that's what we try to do. We try to tell you this is really what's going on. It's not just the UN failing. This is why there is a problem and why solutions cannot be found. It's a very complicated world.
Has the UN determined whether or not there was a chemical attack last time
Right.
before the chemical
Right,
that it did happen?
right.
And has it determined who is responsible for that attack?
Well, that's a very interesting question because the UN did have a mechanism that the Security Council approved two or 3 years ago that allowed investigators to go into Syria to examine the samples and come up with a conclusion not only whether chemical weapons were used, but who was responsible for them. So they used this mechanism on various occasions, and they implicated the Syrian government and ISIS. And then the mechanism came up for renewal. It had to be renewed every year. So lo and behold, Russia vetoed it. They didn't want the UN going into Syria anymore and implicating the Syrian government because they're close allies. So that ended that mechanism. Nevertheless, there is something called the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which is basically works to protect the Chemical Weapons Convention. They can go into Syria and take samples and conclude only that chemical weapons were used. They cannot ascribe blame. So that remains the key, is getting the mechanism to go back into Syria and say, this is the guilty party. Russians will work hard to make sure that that task does not happen. Okay?
Yeah. Can I ask another question about PassBlue?
Yeah.
I'm curious to what extent you follow the UN activities in Geneva. Because although New York is the most famous place, because this
Yeah.
is where the Security Council is, Geneva is also the place where human rights is staffed and those controversies
right.
play out. Do you follow that? Or
Oh,
is
yeah,
that,
yeah.
Is that an unimportant part of the
No,
UN?
no, that's
And-
very important. Even though we don't have people in Geneva, we do have sources, civil society sources in Geneva who will give us information. And for example, we have been following closely the U.S. threats to drop out of the Human Rights Council. And that continues to be a threat that Nikki Haley keeps lobbying whenever the Human Rights Council meets and criticizes Israel. She'll make her threat. She'll send out a press release saying, you know, the Human Rights Council is worthless and we should leave now. So we have been covering that topic very closely. Yeah, but we don't have people there. Yeah.
Who chairs the Human Rights Council now?
Who chairs it? You know, I don't know.
Saudi Arabia.
You mean this session?
Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, well, there you go. But
Yeah, they're a famous defender of
well,
human
you know,
rights.
Obama always said it's better to stay in the Human Rights Council and try to persuade the human rights abusers on the council how important and useful it is to make sure that your citizens have their human rights. So to exclude them probably doesn't help the situation. Thanks very much.